And now it's my pleasure to introduce Alex Rodriguez, who is my current master's student. The cycle continues. Take it away, Alex.
Well, thank you, Melanie. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. Today, I'm going to be talking about mulching perennial cut flowers as we look for ways to reduce water while also establishing healthy plants. So, just to give a brief overview of mulches, typically mulches fall under two categories. The first one being natural or organic mulches. Now, typically, these ones are derived of plant materials or animal byproducts, and some of the characteristics associated with these mulches are obviously weed suppression, soil temperature regulation, improving structure in the soil, and also contributing to either organic matter or soil nutrient content. Um, and these are typically easier for small scale, as oftentimes they are limited by bulk transport and availability. Now, the other grouping is synthetic, so like landscape fabric, plastic film, or mats. They do share similar characteristics as the natural mulches, but oftentimes produce plastic waste, and they do not contribute to organic matter or nutrients in the soil. And as we're looking for alternatives to wool, one of our previous speakers mentioned the use of wool. So with this presentation, I'll be primarily speaking about wool. And one of the neat things about Utah is that it's one of the most meaningful sheep and wool producers in the country, with about 2 million pounds of wool produced annually. Um, Now, for mulching, we're looking at ungraded wool, so wool that's not marketable. Um, no, the price range may vary. The annual average is about 55 cents. And with some of the local options that we have here in the state, such as Robiny White and Blackface, you can see that those prices fall within that range. Although, depending on where you source it, it could be lower. So, for comparing wool to landscape fabric, one of the calculations that we did is how much wool would we need if we were adjusting it at a 4 by 4 foot basis that it would cost to apply landscape fabric. And with that, we estimated that it was about 7.5 pounds or a 3 inch thickness of wool. And so now that we're looking that here in Utah, wool is available and the prices are um, zero mostly or reasonably at a low cost. Another characteristic about wool is it actually has plant nutrients. Now in this table, you can see all 14 plant nutrients, and you can see that the ranges vary. Some are more wide while others are more narrow. Um, and so this makes wool a very good candidate to test for mulching. And I like to point out nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium as those are some of the key nutrients that we're looking for when we're applying fertilizer. Now here, nitrogen is represented as nitrate, which is one of the plant available forms. And so with wool, we wanted to see that influence that it may have on the soil. So what were our goals for this study? The first one being that we wanted to evaluate the performance of on-wash wool as a surface mulch by tracking soil moisture and irrigation water. We also wanted to compare the on-wash wool with conventional landscape fabric and bare soil to determine if there's any impacts on crop growth and performance. We were also looking at root zone soil temperature across the mulch treatments to assess effects on plant development and if there's any stress associated with them. And then lastly, we want to evaluate the longevity on wash wool at the surface of the soil as a mulch and see if there's any contributions to soil nutrients and salinity as well. So our study was conducted in Greenville Farm in Logan. We conducted this study in a quarter-acre field with roughly 1,300 plants. Our mulches included wool, no replacement, so leaving it for the duration of the study, wool annual replacement, so replacing it every year, woven landscape fabric, and bare soil. And to make irrigation comparable across all the different treatments, we had 4 flow meters for each treatment specifically. And to supplement that, we also had soil moisture sensors and other temperature sensors to evaluate the crops. Additionally, we also looked at plant establishment, canopy, height, and yield is something that we'll be looking at this upcoming field season. And additionally, we're also looking at soil nutrients and salinity before and after each one of our growing seasons. So for our study, we selected three perennial cut flowers. We selected coneflower, globe thistle, and sea holly. Now, these three cut flowers were selected because they are low water candidates, which made them really good choices for our city as we look for um, how wool will impact on crop establishment, but also when we're considering irrigation and optimizing our inputs. So here is our a table demonstrating how we, I mean, not a table, a graph, how we chose to inform our irrigation. So on the x-axis, we have the date, and then on the y-axis, we have our soil moisture thresholds. Um, so our ideal soil moisture threshold was between 16 and 24%, as demonstrated in the shaded blue box. So, so when we decided to irrigate, we let the soil moisture drop to 16%, or if it was below the 16% threshold, we would irrigate and bring it up to 24%. Now, another thing that I would also like to point out is that we also have precipitation. So a lot of these peaks here are associated with the rainfall events that we had, whereas other ones are associated with fertilizer application events that we had throughout the field season. And looking at October, you can see that we basically did not have to irrigate as rainfall was primarily supplementing water to our crops. So now if you look at how much water we applied, we actually saved 30% water with the wool. So in this table, and we have the month in the left column, then it's bare in red, fabric in black, and then wool in blue, and then our comparison savings, wool with bare soil. So one of the key things that we saw was obviously 30% water reduction across the field season. You can see that July and September were our biggest months where we applied water. And you can see that we saved about 1,700 gallons of water throughout the field season. And another neat thing about irrigation, and if you're somebody who likes looking at irrigation in terms of time, we actually reduced the irrigation time by 23 hours, which is very impressive. And here on the right, you can see a picture of the flow meters that we used to irrigate our treatments. So looking at water, now let's look at soil temperature. So throughout the field season, we saw that wool actually helped in moderating soil temperature. You can see here, the blue line is represented as the wool, orange is represented as the bare soil, and then black is represented as the black. And then x-axis is the date, and then the y-axis is the temperature at a 4-inch step in Fahrenheit. So you can see, starting in really warm months in the summer, you can see that the wool kept the temperature a lot cooler. And then as we move towards October, you can see that it actually kept the soil insulated and slightly warmer. And if we look at the bare soil and the fabric, you can see that there's greater temperature fluctuations. And on the right here, you can see like the range that it can vary. Wool 5 to 10, fabric 8 to 15, and then bare soil 10 to 20. Now zooming in into one of the hottest weeks in July, it's the same thing with bare soil, orange, fabric, black, and wool, blue. You can just see the day and night differences with wool, fabric, and bare soil. And so during the day, bare soil was actually warmer, and wool kept the temperature cooler by 10 degrees. And if we compare it with the fabric, the wool kept it 6 degrees cooler than the fabric itself. And if we compare fabric with the wool, it kept it 4 degrees cooler, although you can see for some of the days it was within proximity of the same soil temperature. So now looking at establishment for 3 perennial cut flowers, there are 2 graphs, first one being plant height, and then the second one being canopy coverage. And the plant height is measured in inches. And one thing that I would like to note is that the colors are the same, but depending on the species that we have, they're represented by echinacea being the solid lines, eryngium being the dotted line, and then echinops being the dashed line. So looking at plant height, one of the things that we saw is that actually wool and fabric had the same plant height from the beginning towards the end of the field season. So there was no observable differences between the two. They perform About the same, and echinacea was the one that stood out the most, as that one's just a naturally more upright plant, whereas eryngium and echinops are more shallow and more bushy plants. Now, if we compare these three species with bare soil, we can see that the plant height was about a 2.5 inch difference in the wool compared to the bare soil. And even though it's the same in the fabric, it's still pretty impressive that it used less water and yielded the same result. Now, moving down here into canopy coverage, we actually see that the wool had a more observable impact than the fabric itself. So you can see that echinops actually perform a lot better in terms of canopy coverage in comparison to echinacea and eryngium, which seem to have a less impressive performance. And so with the bare soil as well, you can see that all the crops perform better under the wool and the fabric in comparison to just being an exposed soil. So with the canopy coverage, we saw that there was about a 5 to 20% difference depending on the species with the wool and when we're comparing it to the fabric and the bare soil. So so what are some of the findings that we had with our study? The first one obviously being that we were able to reduce 30% of water in the wool compared to the bare soil and the fabric. Also temperature. One of the big things that we're looking at, it helped keep it cooler by 10 degrees, and especially if we're looking at crop stress, crops don't like extreme fluctuations, so keeping the soil temperature moderate is very important. And also crop performance, 2.5 inches greater in terms of plant height and 5 to 20% canopy coverage increase under the wool at establishment is pretty impressive. Um, Now, one thing that I would like to point out is that the mold did not help with weed suppression. We had a hard time with field bindweed. It was just going through the wool and it made it very challenging for us to remove. Um, and so it may be something that could be time consuming if weeds are left to grow longer. So it's important to address weeds when they first emerge to avoid more labor in the field. Um, and so as we move towards 2026, we obviously want to measure yield response, um, how much water we're going to save this summer in comparison to this first season. And we're also looking at wood chips as a mulch. So that's another thing that we're going to be assessing when we compare it to another organic mulch. And then lastly, we're also going to be looking at our soil nutrients from our first field season. We have the data, but we haven't looked at it. So that's something that we'll be discussing in our field day. So if you're interested, we'd be very happy to have you to visit us and we can discuss more wool and also just talk about any new exciting information that we may find in this upcoming field season. And with that, I want to thank all of you for listening. I would also like to thank our collaborators and anybody who helped in any capacity. But now I turn it to you to ask me any questions that you may have.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your work, Alex. Um, there's so much that went into it, and it's wonderful to hear about it here, and especially the take homes from last summer as we prepare for the next. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A. And in the meantime, we'll get started because we have about 6 minutes for questions before we transition to our next talk. So the first one is Alex, was the fabric a dull black color? Can you describe what the landscape fabric was like?
Our fabric had a little bit of shine. It had like strikes across to sort of represent like a foot. Um, so I wouldn't say it was dull.
Yeah, it was pretty straightforward black woven
Yeah.
plastic landscape fabric. Question was, did your wool blow away in the wind?
Okay, so when we first laid down the wool, I did run into that issue where some of the wool it didn't get blown by the wind, but it would kind of sort of roll over and it would cover the plant. So every morning I would have to go and just put it back into place. But after a couple of weeks, it adhered really nicely to the soil. So it's just when you first lay it down, it may have
It,
tendency to do that.
yeah, and when you say it got displaced, how much of it was it all the wool in the field? Was it a pretty significant amount?
Oh, just small portions scattered throughout the field. It wasn't the whole bed that would have the wool removed. It was just a small amount, so it's not like a big problem that's unmanageable.
Before Alex joined our team, we did a pilot study with wool for a couple of years. And the first year I was really worried because our research farm is housed right at the mouth of a canyon, so we can get some wind. And we put bird netting over it or deer netting over it to start to keep it in place. And it was a beast to try to weed it and harvest. And so we didn't do that again because we really didn't need it. It got married to the soil pretty well, especially if you're in a small space and could even water it in a little bit. We had one year we had rain that came shortly after we applied it, and that really kind of solidified it in place. But if you're in a high wind location, you could put some netting over it to start. Let's see here. Oh, great question. What eventually happens to the wool at the end of the season? Does it break down? Do you remove it? What do you do?
Oh, that's a very good question. That's something that we haven't really got around to. And obviously, we're going to remove some of the wool. As to what comes next,
I don't know if
with
it
the
is
wool.
obvious. Why don't you reshare what you're testing, what your different treatments are?
Oh, so we're testing wool replacement annually, wool no replacement, so leaving it for the full duration of the study, landscape fabric and bare soil. And so the wool will not break down immediately. So with the leftover, probably just reuse it for another site as we replace it, but it does not break down.
Yeah, I mean, it does. It's just a very slow rate. So Alex is looking at what happens when it's applied in one year and left for the rest of the study, what happens when we
Mhm.
replace it. And I'll say from putting it at my house a few years ago when we started this study, it definitely persists. I put around 4 inches
Mhm.
down and I'm at about a half inch left, 3 years later, going into four. And that'll be another area of our research that Alex is going to work on, sending out kits to different collaborators around the state so we can understand how quickly it decomposes or not around the state under different conditions, like in the South versus up here. Next question is, did you notice any pest problems with the wool?
With the wool itself, I didn't have any pest issues. Just around the field, we had grasshoppers, but in the wool itself, I saw more beneficial insects than pests. So no pest issues in my experience.
Thank you for that. So Alex, if you could unshare your screen, I'm going to keep asking you some questions so we can run it right up to the hour, but by unsharing, that'll allow Chloe to get set up if she'd like to.
Yeah.
There's a few questions here about the smell. Let's talk about it.
So when we first laid it down, the smell was horrible. You would just walk to the field and you could just smell the wool.
Okay,
But
what is horrible, please?
just the smell of the manure. But I actually don't mind the smell. And I think some of you might be happy to hear this, but it actually is a really good deer deterrent. So the deer will not go to your field if you apply the wool because the smell is just so unfathomable. They just don't even bother looking at it. So
Okay, I would say it's kind of like a wet dog. We use unwashed, so there's manure in it too. For me, it's noticeable as it doesn't bother me personally. But yeah, that is a consideration because we all have different levels of tolerance and so forth.
yeah.
Let's see, we might have a few seconds left for one. There's questions about sourcing, and I know that gets a little bit outside the expertise, but what would you say if someone wanted to add wool, just try it out? Where do you think they could find it?
They could probably go to a local sheep producer or even at the research facilities at the university. They'd be happy to provide some for somebody who's interested in using wool. And that's something that was discussed a lot in the sheep shearing school earlier this year, where they're looking to provide people wool to test as a mulch in their own homes and gardens.
Yeah, thank you. I think social media could be a great place. So
Mhm.
Facebook Marketplace, you could put an ad out there that you're interested in it. You could, Callie gave a talk earlier and she's working with students in FFA and so she had that kind of in for finding wool. But we're also hoping to have a field day this summer where we invite all of you as growers and homeowners and then also some sheep producers too to start putting people in touch.